So good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Social Housing Roundtable. My name is Matthew Baird. I'm a founder of Baird & Co Recruitment, which is my day-to-day job. I've been doing recruitment in housing for 11 years. I'm also the founder of the Social Housing Roundtable. So we set this up 2.5 years ago to try and get more voices heard by anyone and everybody in the social housing sector. The idea being we're going to keep it free for anyone who's maybe a week into housing or 30 years into housing. Your voice is equal and respected on this platform, and we will discuss anything and everything. The membership now is around kind of 600 people, which is absolutely mad. Seeing as 2.5 years ago, I set this up to try and talk to a few clients because I had nothing else to talk to them during lockdown, because no one wanted to talk about hiring because, you know, that wasn't happening. So it's lovely to see people continually coming back. It was lovely to see so many people at the CIH conference last week and at the Hive Live conference with Claire. So thank you to everybody who was able to make all of those events and all your kind words. Today's guest is someone who I met via our still current, I think for another week or so, Lara Oyedele, our CIH president. She was chairing the a platform that was set up, which was trying to kind of encourage and embrace the conversation of what Lara's been doing. And then I saw Alysha speak at a couple of CIH events, have heard about her work through Housing Futures and other things, and thought, got to get you onto the roundtable. It's taken a little bit of time for us to find a slot that works for us both. But it's lovely to have her with us here today. She's got an incredible voice when it comes to this part of the sector, and her passion for the next generation of housing and what needs to change is brilliant. So I'm delighted to have her with us. I'm going to pass over to her to do her own introductions, and we've got a short presentation before we start the general discussion. We've already had a few people introducing themselves in the chat, so please feel free to continue doing that. If during the presentation itself you've got questions, please stick them in the chat. If not, at the end of the presentation, we will be having a more open forum discussion for about 40 minutes. So do use the raise hand function on the reactions tab, and we'd love to hear from you and really get the conversation flowing. So without further ado, Alysha, I'll pass over to you to introduce yourself and let me know when you're ready for me to start your presentation. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Matt. So yeah, first of all, thank you to Matt for having me on as a guest on his very successful Social Housing Roundtable. It's great that I'm able to join. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Alysha Burrell, and I run an organisation called Building Future Leaders, which is all about supporting the next generation of future leaders across the housing and construction sector. And I have very recently, also about 2 weeks ago, stepped down from my position as a non-executive director at a housing association after being a board member for 3 years, which was a great 3 years of really challenging the organisation, the CEO, executive team and board around the organisation's approach to people and culture and future talent development. So yeah, I'm just going to share a couple of minutes with you in a presentation format, and then it'd be great to hear your thoughts and have a proper discussion. So the reason that it's titled Empowering the Future Shaping the Housing Leaders of Tomorrow is because when we're thinking about the next generation and shaping the sector's future leaders, I think that a lot of the issues in the sector are actually leadership issues. And one of those issues is related to recruitment and retention. And when you shape leaders, you're essentially shaping the direction of the housing sector, because it's the leaders who will be making the decisions. So yeah, I'm just going to present some ideas about the issues, challenges, and some of the solutions as well in attracting, retaining, and shaping the housing sector's future leaders. So the next slide shows the problem. So the problem is that 20% of the sector is set to retire by 2027. There's a lack of young people moving into the industry, which is affecting the skills shortage. And these reasons vary from the lack of understanding about the different career roles and routes in the industry, to the sector's poor reputation and image, to the lack of diversity resulting in the lack of role models to encourage people to enter and remain in the industry as well. So the government have still set this very ambitious aim to build 300,000 homes a year. However, the statistics on the screen show that 35% of the workforce are over the age of 50, 20% of workers are below the age of 30, and the industry requires 950,000 workers by 2030 to meet demand for net zero targets. So essentially, there's more that the sector can be doing to really make housing a attractive career of choice. So that's the problem. So on the next slide, I'm not sure if you're aware of Simon Sinek, but he did a very famous TED talk about how great leaders inspires action, and he calls on business leaders to start with why. So he explains that most organizations can explain what they do. Some organizations can explain how they do what they do, but very few organizations know why they do what they do. And when we're talking about the social housing sector's need to attract more individuals, it's important for the sector to really be able to explain and relay why the sector does what it does to attract people. Like, why do housing associations exist? Why should a young person want to work in the industry? So I think that shaping housing's leaders, we must first identify our own values and motivations and examine our own why we chose to work in the industry or continue to work in the industry. Like, what values stop you from moving from housing to a completely new sector like finance, for example? And the majority of the time, it's really because of the social purpose, that social impact that you're making. So on the next slide, I will be talking about some of the solutions. So in order to attract the next generation into housing, we should really be engaging with academic institutions and going into schools and colleges, universities, talking to young people about what the sector has to offer. And research shows that by the time a student goes to university, they've already decided what career they want to pursue, the type of companies they want to work for. So we know that talking to young people at an early age is important to improve their long-term engagement with the sector. So if you look at the companies that do attract top young talent, which is what this slide shows, if you look at the companies that graduates most want to work for, they are the financial companies, the technology companies, the law firms, the healthcare companies. And the question is why? And I think the reason is because young people understand what those companies stand for. They are the companies that have developed that reputable brand amongst students. They're the companies that people have clarity about, the career options that are available and the career routes that they can pursue, and also are known to provide stability and have impact. So on this slide, it shows the UK did there's an annual student survey, and it shows 300 top employers that graduates would most want to work for. Now, there is not one housing association that is featured on that list of 300 companies, which, I think is quite sad, because when people are looking for companies that they want to work for and they see this list, housing associations are working for the social housing sector, that's not going to crop up in their mind. Now, interestingly, house builders like Barratt's and other construction companies do come on the list. So I think the question is, if the social housing sector is falling behind in losing top talent, then what can the social housing sector be learning from other companies who are featuring on the list? So on the next slide, I'll talk you through the Building Future Leaders strategy of attraction, which is also a strategy of empowerment as well. So we ran a summer internship program for 18 to 30-year-olds, and we got them to write an essay based on one of 5 housing questions, which range from what can the sector do to tackle climate change to there's a lack of diversity and inclusion in the sector and what can be done about it. There was a question on should housing be the government's top priority? And we found that a lot of people would enter based on the questions because they felt empowered to share their own experiences and views of the social housing sector and their experiences in the sector through their essays. Another thing that we do a lot is speaking. So I'm sure you've all heard the phrase, I fell into housing. And when you're talking to young people and you're sharing your story, I fell into housing isn't very inspiring to the next generation. So I think also changing some of the language that we use. So instead of saying, I fell into the industry, explaining what actually led you into the industry without saying that you fell into it. Is also important. And then we also run events, careers fairs, and social media. So the power of storytelling is I think, very important. Sharing your story, but also sharing the story of your organization and the sector as a whole as well. Because when we quote facts and statistics, people are less likely to remember those. But when you share a story, because of the emotion that comes from the story, if you're sharing a story of tenants and residents and the positive impact of your organization, it's more likely to resonate with people. So storytelling is also a great way to attract and retain as well. I'm going to touch a bit on retention as well, because research also shows that millennials, the Gen Z generation, are the job hopper generation and like to move jobs every 2 to 4 years. So if the sector's, very keen on retaining talent, then more needs to be done in terms of keeping those in organisations, but also not losing people to other sectors as well. Diversity is also important. So when we think about attraction and retention, interestingly, 88% of students actively research an organisation's commitment to diversity and inclusion when applying for a job. And I don't know if you've noticed, but now more and more people, not just young people, people in general, are using social media to call out companies for their lack of diversity and inclusion. And whether it's right or wrong, companies are being named and shamed publicly. And, it only takes one person to write that social media post about how bad their experience has been in a company before that post goes viral. And then people look at it and think, I'm not going to work for them anymore. And that is company reputational damage. So when we're talking about diversity and inclusion and its impact on attraction and retention, it is really important. The last thing I'm going to touch on is the investment in training and development in terms of retention, and empowering people through mentoring and coaching and leadership courses, which is one of the things that we do at Building Future Leaders as well. We've got our leadership course launching this month, but also reverse mentoring as well. So the talk is titled Shaping the Future Leaders of Tomorrow. But when I talk about future leaders, I'm not just talking about graduates and young people. I do think it is one of the easiest ways to attract and shape new talent in the sector, because negative perceptions may not be so deeply ingrained. But future leaders, are all those who are wanting to manage and lead teams and organizations. So I do think the sector needs to be more creative in its approach and have a better succession plan, collaborate more, because there are other, people who are looking for a career change, many people who did not go through the traditional academic route, and those who just want to do something with a social purpose as well. So there's a lot of talent, but I think the sector definitely needs to be more creative in its approach of attraction and retention in shaping the next generation of leaders who some would say are more purpose over paychecks. So I will end there.
There we are. No, thank you. I'm going to stop sharing that screen for a second. Firstly, thank you very much. I think that was a really, very much a whistle-stop tour, but a very much kind of a really interesting kind of oversight of some of the key issues I think we're having at the moment. And there's a number of things in the chat which I'm going to come to in just a moment. But from those you're speaking with, you know, you mentioned that 88%, I think, of young people look at EDI. Does that translate to the sector as well in terms of those you're speaking with who are maybe looking for that next step with another housing provider? If the culture isn't right, are they looking at similar things? You know, your more junior people in housing or your mid-level managers, are they also assessing things like culture quite regularly before deciding whether to either move to a different housing provider or to stay in housing altogether?
Yes, I think one of the main reasons that the sector does lose so many people is not just salary, but also the culture of the industry and EDI. If they don't feel like they're able to progress in their careers, then it is an issue. But also in terms of EDI for young people, it's whilst they are thinking about it, I think the main issue is that they genuinely just don't know and understand about the industry. So I think that's the main issue, the lack of understanding about the industry.
I couldn't agree more. It's something that, and actually, just before you said the word fell into housing, someone had put in the chat exactly that. You know, anecdotally, lots of colleagues in the sector fall into it. If anyone would like to enter the chat, please do raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you. I'm going to go through some of the points in the chat now, but you know, do please feel free to, like I say, raise that hand. Some of the points in the chat just before I come to Roy there. So this idea of falling into housing, this idea of not seeking out, I think Neil had put routinely, he was one of the few that actually ran into it head first. And I'd love to maybe hear from him later on in terms of how we even found out about it. Because when I first, 11, 12 years ago was told, Matt, we want you recruiting for housing. I was like, how do you recruit for a tower block? I don't really understand what this means. Now I'd been and got my degree. I did my degree in history. I've actively followed the social side of things an awful lot from a sociology perspective, yet I didn't know about this sector. And I really liked your point that you mentioned there about actually what message are we telling people when we fell into it, when we didn't actively seek it out? What does that message say to young people? And do you find people switch off, Alysha, when you talk to people? Do you find people that maybe going, well, why would I go for something that even those who work in it weren't seeking out?
Yeah, I think because of the perception of I don't really know what it is. If you are at a careers fair and your stand has housing on, a lot of people are just going to walk past because it's already ingrained in their mind that they don't want to work in the industry because they don't really understand what it is. So you first need to have those conversations so that you open it up so that you can really explain the diverse range of roles in the industry. But if you have a stand that says future leaders, people are like, oh, leadership, what's that about? So then you gauge their interest straight away, and then you can go down, oh, well, it's leadership in housing, in construction. So it's just a different way of explaining what the sector does.
I think that doubles down as well from a perspective of the amount of people who I speak to week in, week out who go, Matt, I've kind of done everything I can in my role and I want a new role in housing and I like this and I like this, but I don't know where to go. People in housing don't know housing roles. So how can those outside know about it too? Couldn't agree with you more. Roy, it's great to have you with us. Before I jump back to the chat, please do come in. It's lovely to hear from you.
Sorry, I didn't realize my camera off. Yeah, thank you. Just a quick because I sort of fell into it as well. But I loved it as soon as I started, and I was a massive advocate for housing. I still am. But I think we massively undo a lot of the good work we do and a lot of the goodwill we do with constant restructures because everything, the landscape's ever changing. I've now moved to another organisation. The last organisation I worked, we had 3 restructures in 9 years. We had it certainly felt, even though I wasn't affected by a lot of them, people in senior positions who were looking after themselves because they'd had a long career and were making decisions what basically benefited them, rather than potentially some up and coming young leaders or with people with fresh, bright ideas. You seem to see a lot of those go to the wayside. And for me, I just think, whilst that's ongoing, while we having to constantly respond to ongoing change, I know the industry will have to do constantly anyway, because obviously changing legislation and all the rest. I feel like it's going to be a very difficult challenge to sort of retain your top talent and avoid them coming in at an early age, having a load of experience, doing some numerous different roles, and then going on to, say, finance or something. I worked at income, and luckily I've stayed in because I love housing, and I've gone on to do something different within housing now. But I could quite have happily gone and started working for a private company. So I don't feel like we do ourselves justice by the constant change and churn of what we do.
Alysha, any thoughts on that?
I think that's a really great point, and I think that in terms of the restructures, and I hear your point in terms of it's difficult for new people to come in because of that, but in terms of the retention of top talent, I think even if organisations can do programs in terms of secondments, for example, I mean, that's a great way to retain talent, where they can learn from other organisations for, let's say, 6 months. I know some organisations are a bit wary, or you go into a new organisation, they're gonna you're gonna learn from their processes and all of that. But I think that's a really great way to bring the sector together and collaborate, really, and not do things in such a siloed format, and shadowing, things like that. So I do think it's possible. I just think that it needs that commitment from the top level.
Couldn't agree more. And certainly from a recruitment and retention piece, I think that speaks volumes. And I couldn't agree with you more, Roy. I think a lot of people don't always know their place if there's too many restructures and too much movement. I think if you're doing it, as Alysha said, whether it's a comment or indeed an apprenticeship, housing, I said this last week at the conference, we don't use apprenticeships anything like enough. There's so many that we could utilise. It's madness. And there's a huge pot of money waiting to be used that we don't touch. And
I think with apprenticeships, a lot of organisations are underutilising or don't necessarily know how to use their apprenticeship levy effectively. So I think that's also...
and it's also, people think it's just for young people, and it's absolutely not. I was sat there with one of the HR team from Sovereign Housing, and she's doing her apprenticeship and upskilling that way, and absolutely not junior, tons of knowledge and speaking on a panel, and yet doing an apprenticeship. There's definitely a cultural piece, and I know, Roy, you mentioned it in the chat. Actually, I was going to come to it, which was sparking a little bit of conversation, which was that, you mentioned that when sharing stories, we need the local media on our side, promoting the good stuff on our channel to fine. But this work is undone by one story where damp, mold, or another issue has affected a family. And that's a really difficult one, because it has been kind of counteracted a little bit by Neil and others. And it is a balance, which is we don't help ourselves in comms response to the legitimate challenges that come through. The work that Quajo's doing, a lot of businesses are highly behind providing a public good meaning when we do well, and some organisations can skip a line in acknowledging the impact of decisions and showing contrition on addressing them. And there is that balance between the two. And when we're trying to attract people to the sector, but also keep people in it, which is why when we talk about future leaders, and Alysha mentioned it before, I put a post up last month, a couple of months ago, about whether or not there should be a time limit on chief execs in the same way there are chairs of the board. Now, it's a huge debate, don't get me wrong, which is part of the joy of it. But equally, there's people, as you mentioned there, Roy, who have been in their roles a very long time, who perhaps need to move on, or perhaps need to be really questioned about whether they're still doing in the right position they should be within housing. And that's how you get your future leaders through, because, and I'm sure Alysha will back this up, the amount of people I know who've been in the sector, worked till they burn out in the sector, don't feel they can go anywhere, leave the sector and set up as their own consultants, is growing really, and growing quite considerably. Alysha, I imagine, you're probably one of them, Alysha, judging by what you're doing yourself now.
Yeah.
Because
I mean, there's
go on, right.
sorry, I was going to say, like, with so many working groups and collaboration between different organisations, but there doesn't seem to be one about how we sell ourselves and how we market ourselves, and you know, like Northern Housing Consortium and things like that. Do we not need to create something where all the heads are together and thinking, right, well, how do we market ourselves? It could be something that we all fund together. You know what I mean? That then we do like a full mark, because you're not going to get. So, for example, I'm working in Leeds at the moment. There's numerous different organisations in Leeds, and they're all loggerheads with each other because they all want the customers that are out there. We need a collaborative approach to it to draw people in, draw customers in, show them what we do, and then you can start to look at, right, how do you sort of create your own little diverse part of that, where you then going out to your own customers and your own client base. But we need to be sort of raising knowledge, like I say, around what social housing actually is. And I mean, I was nearly 30 when I got into it. I still had no idea what it did until I got behind the curtain, if you know what I mean. So how do others?
Yeah, completely agree. And Alysha, I imagine this is something you're hearing all the time.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point in terms of getting the local media on side, because if you think about the amount of programs on TV related to housing, so you've got, you know, like Homes Under the Hammer, you've got location, you've got loads of housing, you know, programs on TV. There's about like over 15 of them, but none of them relate to what the sector actually does or how you get into the industry or are inspiring people to work in the sector. That could be a great project that the sector could come together and fund, or if the sector comes together and says, you know, let's run this campaign. But the sector doesn't seem to be doing that, and I'm not quite sure why.
I think personally, I think that's something from a CIH or a NatFed perspective could work, but also, and I asked this last week, I don't know whether or not housing actually trusts each other. That's a whole nother conversation, but there's always an us and them. There's always yeah, but we know we're doing it right. We know we've got our flaws, but are they actually doing it any better, or are they hiding there's a lot of mistrust? Neil, I'm going to bring you in. Good to have you with us.
Cheers. Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpick. I think fundamentally at the moment we can't polish a turd. So if we're going to go out and try and promote ourselves, we've got to acknowledge there's some serious systemic issues within the sector to resolve, typically around property condition and our response to customers. One of the big issues for the sector is that you have circa 1,300 registered providers, depending which way you slice it, but you have around 240 odd organisations that own 95% of the stock. So the nature of the organisations that operate within the sector are highly diverse, and they run from literally owning a handful of organisations for a very specific cause to, you know, hundreds of thousands of units. I've name dropped Clarion there, but you've got Sanctuary as well, who are just as big. You've got Peabody, who are just as big. Merge with the organisation I'm shortly going to move to between Southern and Network Homes shifts that up to 82,000 units. So you're talking there, you know, the size of a city in terms of assets and the number of people impacted. I think where we need to focus, if we're going to do any of that, is around our external affairs and lobbying with government as opposed to our marketing, because we have over 250,000 households at the moment living in temporary accommodation. There's not a lack of demand for social housing, there's a lack of supply. What we don't have currently is a coherent narrative we can sell to government and a coherent position to sell to them to say, actually, we are part of the solution, not part of the problem. I cannot stress enough, I'll try and get off my soapbox a little bit, we have managed to convince a government who is fundamentally averse to red tape to recreate an entire regulatory regime. And we've done that in the space of 10 years. Okay, so the Localism Act came in 2011, ripped apart what was then the HCA and TSA, and basically focused on both the financial and governance viability standards. We have now brought back in consumer standards to be regulated on a proactive basis, removal of the serious detriment test. And we've done that in the space of time it takes from a kid to be born to basically get into high school, which is impressive, very, very impressive. It is a failure on our part. So we have to understand where we are. I get there's some little bits in terms of all competition here, but generally housing associations certainly the ones I've worked with have worked very well together, or at least attempt to. I used to work in central Birmingham for what was then Family Housing Association Birmingham, and you would be on a street where you'd have Birmingham, you would have Bromford, you would have what is now Citizen, you would have Midland Heart, and 3 different organisations on the same street. And you could tell because they all had the different placards out of the house declaring it was their unit and all the different ways that they uplifted the stock. So I don't necessarily agree on that element, but there is a clear issue with how we are aligning ourselves with government, and there's a clear issue in fundamentally the services that we provide to our customers that we need to address before we go around telling everyone, hey, actually we're great. Because what we'll see coming out of the TSMs is not going to be pretty. In fact, it's going to be the opposite of that. So there's a reckoning to be had with our own perceptions where we are compared to the actual reality.
I think what's interesting, and I'd love to hear Alysha's thoughts on this and anybody else's as well, is that I completely agree with what you've said there. Absolutely no question. And the housing roundtable wouldn't exist if people didn't trust each other. But I think there are sometimes mistrust, but that's a whole nother debate, as I say. The thing that comes forward for me, though, is that we struggle to attract staff. We have a huge shortage in officers. We have a huge shortage in frontline staff. And then coming through middle management, when it comes to diversity compared to executive, it's just horrendous. It really, really is. I mean, there's no other word for it compared to the amount of staff from BME communities, like executive below compared to executive percentile wise. It's completely broken. The bigger issue for me is that this isn't exclusive to housing. People know education is a really tough gig and it's horrible and it's underpaid and yada yada. People know the NHS is a tough gig and it's underpaid. People know the police is a tough gig and underpaid and under-resourced. Housing's the same. We're trying to attract people with, in some ways, I guess, a similar mindset, which is a social mindset and putting people first and social care and the rest of it. And yet we're not known about in the same conversation as those. If you're speaking to a young person who's like, oh, I'd love to do something for people, but I don't really want to go into health and I don't want to go into the police. People go, well, maybe try the services or something along those lines, or the NHS. They don't look at housing as an option. And I think going back to Alysha's perspective, I imagine, Alysha, this is one of your frustrations, is you're speaking to people like this who are interested in doing something for the greater good, as it were, with a social heart, a role with a social heart to it. And yet housing's never even in the conversation.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is that lack of understanding that there are actually housing studies degrees that you can do, which are accredited by the CIH. So if you think about those who are, I mean, most of the, can I ask those who are on this call, did any of you do a specific housing related degree or subjects?
I'll stick a quick poll on the chat and we'll get some questions to that, just because that's a really, really interesting point.
It is. And I think that, yeah, most people who work in the industry didn't go through the traditional housing degree route. Even so, for example, myself, I did an economics degree, but I chose to work in the industry because of the fact that it started when I went to India, and then I did my dissertation about housing and inequality. So I knew that I wanted to work in the industry. But again, for me, it was just I didn't understand the roles available.
And that seems to be, as I say, that's one of the similar things in the sector as a whole. I've just put that up as a poll question. What I will do is I'm going to bring Alison in to bring her point to the chat before going to some of the points in the chat that I definitely want to bring in. So Alison, over to you.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Absolutely great.
I'm in the garage waiting for my car. So my pulse.
You can join the housing roundtable from anywhere.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I was just wanting to respond to what you said, really, Matt, in terms of that thing about people being attracted to tough, they're knowing about stuff's a tough gig. I think perhaps slightly in contradiction to what's been said earlier, I think we perhaps need to be more honest about, I don't think it's about marketing it as anything shiny or calling it an industry. I think more likely to attract people who've got that social purpose. Because let's face it, it is a tough gig, and if people come in, I've met many of them, as you know. I've been around a lot of years. I've been involved with the GEM program and all sorts. And if you paint it as something shiny, you A, get the wrong type of people, and B, they don't hang around anyway. I mean, that might be just me being old and out of touch, but you know, I
don't think there's a fear from young people to work hard. I don't think there's a fear from those who worked in other sectors to come in and make a difference. You know, we're getting so much talent attraction from outer sector now. It's brilliant. But again, it's that piece around people not even knowing what it is to begin with, and when you do, like you say, people stay in it.
But I know I'm on the scratch record again, but I think there's a lot of people, particularly at the top, who try and paint everything, and there's all that kind of comms attached to everything that wasn't there when I started out, and I just think it blurs what we're actually trying to do sometimes.
Completely
Almost contradictory, you know.
I mean, Jasmine's mentioned there in the chat that since Ofsted regulations have come in, we're seeing a lot more training offered to our staff, which is helping to retain employees. Larita, a lot of companies stated offer internships and entry-level roles. But do you see this often in the social housing sector? I've seen many roles, but it still tends to require experience. Creativity is definitely the key in attracting talent, particularly since other industries seem to offer prospects, including perks and salaries. And I think that's a really, really interesting point, actually, before I jump through the rest of the chat. I remember raising this question because I'm on the board. I'm the co-chair of the board for Spring Housing in Birmingham, a phenomenal charity in the supported housing sector. And we were going through a review of some of their new hires and things like that. What they were finding is those with the least experience actually were some of their best new hires, because they learned the culture. Maybe a bit more time was spent with people because they didn't know housing to begin with. But also they were joining for the cultural idea of housing, not just because, oh, well, this is what I'm doing, so I best go get a job somewhere else. And I think that's really, really important when we look at the sector as a whole. And Alysha, I mean, when you're speaking to leaders of all levels, because as I say, we wanted to make sure this wasn't just kind of entry or anything like that. When we're speaking to leaders of all levels, are we getting to the stage where people are feeling like they can't go anywhere because they've got experience that they can't get without getting that job?
I think it depends on the organisation and the team. So I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and somebody mentioned that they just aren't able to progress because it's just not in their team structure, so they would have to go elsewhere. And I think that is a fair point. And I think if that happens, it is about those leaders in the organisation being honest in terms of other people's, career progression and development, to say, okay, we're really not able to, let's say, promote you or provide you with the development that you need, but we're working with this company, so common, all of that. So I do think, I keep saying collaboration, but I do think there is more that the sector can be doing to collaborate.
When you're speaking to businesses about this collaboration, what kind of pushback are you getting? Because evidently that's the nature of the business that you're almost setting up yourself.
Well, it goes back to Roy's point, restructuring. Restructuring money, difficulty with designing programs, designing things that are new, piloting new things. So I think the industry does want to do things, but I just think it's lacking that creativity and that risk taking to try new things. Because I think people will say, yeah, we should do it, it's a great idea, but not necessarily take the risk in trying new approaches.
It is funny how we're a sector which I feel, when it comes to tech, we sometimes just dive in 2 feet first without even knowing what maybe the tech does. But when it comes to culture, we're very risk averse. I'll come to you in just a second, Roy, because there's a really interesting point from Alysha there. Joe had put in the chat what housing qualifications are offered to those aged 16 to 18. Are there housing apprenticeship schemes for those wanting to escape the standard box of higher education? There are. I know that there are issues with a couple of businesses failing the Ofsted inspection. So trying to find someone who's actually running this centrally is really difficult. There is definitely a housing apprenticeship. It is available. Trying to find colleges or CIHs that are running it is sometimes a challenge, and that's a real shame. And as Neil put, a number of organisations run apprenticeships, and the GEM programme is great for graduates, but it's a bit of a piecemeal in terms of the former. Tony said he works in IT, and I've worked in several housing associations, and I find what I learn in one, I can take to the next and modify they work because such and such organisation did it that way, and it worked well. And that's the exact same with myself. You know, when it comes to recruitment, you'd be amazed actually the way some people have been stuck in certain boxes for years. But it's whether or not you're working with businesses that want to listen, and sometimes that's hard because sometimes they know best, even though actually things have changed. And Michael Scarage, but the programs are about self-enrichment and not social value. On the poll, Alysha, to go back to the point you've made, so we've had 22 people out of 26 in the ring vote. 8 people have said that yes, they're qualified. 3 have got a degree, and 11 people haven't been qualified. And that, you know, so it's a 50-50 split in terms of people actually being qualified. And I know that's going to come in as a mandated thing, apparently, at some point in some guys. God knows what that soundbite was all about. But sorry for sounding potentially a bit pessimistic there. But yeah, I think that's your point, is people are getting qualified in different ways. And if people knew how to get qualified, and a bit like a health and social, if you work in health and social care, you do your MVQ level 3, 4, 5. People know the route there, don't know what you're doing in the housing world. Roy, I'm going to bring you in, then I'll go to Joe, back to Alysha, and then back to the chat. So Roy, over to you first.
Hey, sorry, just a quick one. So we're talking about, like, say, retention and, you know, promoting ourselves and things like that. Couldn't agree more. What happened with our was absolutely awful. But it's interesting because that happened at Rochdale. Was it Rochdale Homes? Or the Housing Association, Rochdale, didn't it?
Rochdale Housing.
Yeah. So we've got, as said earlier on, over 1,000 providers. And, I mean, just talking internally, we've got over 95% satisfaction rate with what we're doing. So I get that we have lots of issues, but we're also doing a hell of a lot right. And like I said, this is what we're talking about, what's portrayed in the media, and rightly so. When something like that happens, it needs to be challenged and then it needs to be put right. But everybody is tarred with the brush of what happened within that one organisation. Now, it will be happening in other organisations, maybe not to the same degree. But what I'm saying is I don't understand how we can progress if one issue in one organisation then hits every single other organisation right across the sector.
I think what's been interesting, you've seen the sector response, which is suddenly everyone has got on top of damp and mould, and I'm yet to find a business which hasn't got a bigger issue with damp and mould than they ever let on. And I think this is the other side of the narrative. And it was interesting. I hosted a conversation with the Ombudsman at the CIH conference last week, and they said, look, we aren't in any way, shape or form your enemy. All we can literally do is hold a mirror to you guys and see whether or not what you're doing is right or wrong. And you think that we're out to get you, and actually all we're doing is showing you your practice and what you're doing. And there is the problem. I think what's interesting is no matter what sector you go into, you can find problems. But yeah, we're not even getting people talking about joining housing, and those who are in it sometimes feeling like there's a glass ceiling. And that's certainly in the EDI space. There's a glass ceiling. We can't go any further. We've got amazing people who've been on this roundtable for the last couple of years who'll be phenomenal leaders at changing the sector in the future. And yet they're never given the opportunities to lead because those opportunities aren't coming up.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I know what I said then, but that's more of a question, like I said, because I don't know the answer to that. And it's the reality of what's happening. But how can you ever change that narrative is sort of what I'm saying. Do you?
Yeah, agreed.
I don't know what the answer is to that, because if you can't promote because there are failings, we're never going to be able to promote because there's always going to be failings. It's the nature of what we do.
And we've got the stock isn't at the level it needs to be, and a lot of that we haven't built enough homes, but the housing associations are getting blamed for that. Joe, I'm going to come to you. Thanks, Roy. Thank you very much.
Hi, good morning. I obviously working for the charity, a registered provider of supported housing. I think I've got a slightly different angle to quite a lot of you on this.
Excellent.
We, as an organisation, one of the challenges I think we face is that the tenders and contracts that we bid for supported housing are all really short term now. There's no 5-year contracts. So we're winning contracts and we're having to recruit on a temporary basis with a view to trying to make some of those temporary contracts permanent. We're also winning contracts where we then have to TUPE staff in from other organisations and services and help and support them through the TUPE process. And that's really hard. And I understand that fills people with fear all the time when they have to come over to a new organisation, and how are they going to integrate, and are they going to be managed out in some sort of process of restructure because we suddenly end up with too many people doing the same thing. And then obviously coming back to my original point, that all of a sudden in 18 months time we find the contract is up for tender again, and we might not win it, and those poor staff are then having to contract onto another organisation through TUPE, and it is a horrible level of uncertainty all the time. And I know that's coming from a council perspective, it's not driven by us, but
it's key in the housing world. It's a big part of the housing world.
Yeah, and I feel like it needs to come from much issues and the uncertainty that it feeds into the industry. Because, you know, if somebody's first experience of being inside this sector is within 2 years facing TUPE or something else, it's horrible.
Alysha, what are your thoughts?
So I had a question. Do you embed social value into your tenders then? What emphasis are you placing on the social value part in your tenders?
So I haven't been involved in the tenders that we write. I deal with the onboarding of property, so forgive my ignorance on that. And I think adding the social value is probably quite a new thing for the organisation. And it probably should be part of what we put in, but I don't know how they do that right now.
I think, I think the point that you made is there. And I think one of the reason that I mentioned social value is because I think it is a great way to get more people into the industry, even if it is their first role, because I think the sector just needs to be honest. And I think if people are aware about what roles really involve, then I think they will want to stay. But I think, the social value part, and even if it's, let's say you win the contract and it's for, I don't know, 2 years or whatever, that's a great period of time for somebody who is has to do like a year placement, 2-year placement in university, for example, and then they go back to university for their final year. So I think it can definitely work.
Okay.
And but it's an interesting one, because as you say, there's definitely an issue, and while I fully agree with you, Alysha, there's definitely an issue as well in terms of recruitment at the moment. Like I say, I've been doing this for 11 years. It's never been harder. Recruitment in housing is incredibly difficult at the moment. And to kind of go along with that narrative, if all you can do is advertise 1 year, 2-year jobs, particularly when you're first coming out of uni or you're coming out of college and you want something stable as a career, that's not attractive, because people are going, I want something longer term. But as Joe's mentioned, but that's all we can do. It's a really, really difficult point. I'm really glad you raised it, Joe. Thank you. Claire, I'm going to bring you in.
Thanks, Matt. Just wanted to pick up on Ron's...
You're a little bit quiet. Sorry.
We go, put the sound up. Is that better?
Yeah.
Just wanted to pick up on Roy's sort of comment and question there of, you know, how do we kind of celebrate and advertise ourselves, market ourselves, if we are all being tarred with the same brush, for want of a better term. And I think it's coming back to what Alysha said and Alison, we've got to be honest. We've just got to admit that we have got problems and we need really good people to help us with those problems. And I don't know about anyone else, but when we sort of say that whole, but we're doing some really good things as well, and let's shout about them and not worry too much about the, you know, the 5% that's not great. That makes me feel uncomfortable. It feels a little bit like, or it made me feel the same as I feel when people say, oh, why are women still moaning about equality? Because you've got a lot more equality now, so you should be happy. And it's, well, no, because not quite there. It's still a long way to go. And I feel the same with housing. We should be focusing on where we've still got to go, rather than you know, if you live in social housing, which I have done, and I have seen the landlord wanting to shout about the good things they're doing, and I think, yeah, but that's what you should be doing anyway. I'm still concerned about this, that, and the next thing, and that's what I want to hear about. I don't really want to hear about, yeah, we are giving you a home, and yeah, I know that's what you're supposed to do. I'll get back off my soapbox.
No, don't. I think it's a really good point. Alysha, over to you.
Yeah, I think what you just mentioned, I'm going back to bringing Neil's point as well, in terms of really focusing on current customers and residents. And I think one of the questions that some organisations should ask itself is, if more homes need to be built, then should some organisations stop development and focus on a couple of years of just improving quality in the homes that they currently have, and improving the standard of quality for current customers and tenants? So I think that's one of the questions that organisations should ask itself. But again, those kind of questions will be led from boards and the CEOs, and then it's all about the profit and all of that's being made. But I do think that's important. If we're saying more homes need to be built, but current quality isn't great, what is the balance?
And it's forever going to, I think, be the challenge until potentially, I mean, there was a report I think came out the other week from Inside Housing, which was the local councils and how many homes they're building, and the numbers are just so low. And until that gets rectified, I think we're going to carry on being in this problem. And as you've said, there are some businesses who have definitely focused more on that profit margin than they have on maybe looking after the stock. And that's such a hard thing for so many people in housing, because they don't want to be tarred with that brush. But then similarly, when we're talking about leaders of tomorrow, that's something as a culture that you need to be bringing in. But also, I go back to the NHS, we hear stories about, I mean, we just had the nurse and what she obviously did to those poor children and everything else. I guarantee that isn't the one story that's stopping people applying to work in the NHS, though. So whilst you have things like what happened with Anwar Bishak, I don't think that's going to be this kind of thing of, God, no one wants to go work in that sector then, because there'll be people who go, right, well, I don't want to see that happen. I want to go in and fix that. And you'll get the same amount of balance. Just before I bring Neil in on the chat, so Claire said, so many people I've worked with in housing started as temps. I think that probably goes back to the point made by, I think it was Joe before. Completely agree. It's a foot in the door, and you get a chance to find out exactly what the sector's all about. Lee Collymore, I worked in schools for circa 10 years before entering housing, and I'd never heard anyone mention housing as a career option within school. That probably says everything we need to know about this as a sector here. But Joe's mentioned she started her level 4 in housing age 45, and massive congratulations to you for it. Lisa, I've done housing qualifications, but was after I joined the organisation and understood what housing is all about. I wanted to know more. I do know younger people than myself who were doing a housing degree because they couldn't get into social work, and then many dropped out. And this is the issue, I think, with qualification sometimes. Claire agrees with Alison. When we celebrated the sector at the awards shortly after the coroner's report, we were rightly condemned. And Hazel said, I don't know where my English and Women's Studies degree would take me in the late 90s, but enabled me to enter housing to work in a mother and baby unit due to my experience in women's studies. I'm still here 24 years later, having held many roles within housing, charities supported like LA, social care and HA, surviving restructures and taking new opportunities. Tony said there's a big difference in autonomous housing organisations from housing run by local authorities. And Lisa, we've recruited thinking about those transferable skills. Brilliant to hear. We have a very knowledgeable housing team are developing their skills, police, ex-paramedic, ambulance call handlers. I think we need to focus on excellent customer service skills being most important, and other skills and knowledge can be worked on. Neil, I'm going to bring you in because I could keep going through the chat, but I want to make sure we're hearing voices in the last kind of 2-3 minutes that we've got. So Neil, over to you.
I'm happy to defer to Alysha if you want, because I've already spoken and appreciate they haven't. So yeah.
Wonderful. We'll come back to you then. Alysha, please do come in.
Hi guys, can you hear me okay?
We can. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you. I think you made a good point around why people are put off housing. And if you look at it statistically, most people that work in housing live in social homes and therefore know the realities of what it's like when their parents are trying to get a repairs in and might face some sort of discrimination, or the condition of the homes that they currently live in within that kind of social council estate. And then for those young people to be like, oh yeah, I really want to work in housing, there's a mismatch. So it's quite interesting that a lot of people that come in to housing, especially from the BAME community, actually live in social homes and understand a lot of what it's like to be, face any difficulties or issues they have with the local authority or the housing provider. And also, I think how we move forward, I completely agree with the whole advertising, the shiny, marketing materials, and the reality of working in housing. I've worked in housing for the past 8 years, and I've left. I'm an NED of a housing association, but I'm also a consultant that looks at social value within regeneration and retrofit. So I have worked in housing for many years, and the complexities and the workload and things that you face in housing, as well as someone from African heritage, is very complex. The same as people who are women or have different religions or disabilities. So I think the way forward for me, from my understanding, my personal experience, that is to actually showcase what we're doing as a sector to improve things when it comes to equality, when it comes to how we treat our staff, when it comes to contracts. Showcase that. Stonewalls is a good example of that, for instance, but showcasing what we're doing to improve the culture of the organisation. And actually that helps us to look into the culture of our organisation before going to advertise young people and people living from different experiences, but to showcase what we're doing to improve and also to confront particular cultures within the organisation, I think is a really powerful way of doing it. And I think that's part of the way forward.
Alysha, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about changing the culture, so I'm going to go back to reverse mentoring. So I think reverse mentoring is a very powerful way of bringing in different perspectives. I mean, I've done reverse mentoring before, and I've done sessions on race, ethnicity, gender, future leaders. And at the end of each session, it was with a white male director. And at the end of each session, he would say, okay, so how can I use this to use my position to change things in my team and in the organization? And I think that is what is needed. So I totally agree with Aisha's point.
Yeah, so do I. And I think a point that's really interesting. I'm aware we're running out of time, so if people do have to bounce, please feel free. I just want to make sure we're wrapping up today. But I also agree that if culturally you've got a business which isn't looking after BME community, which isn't looking after people equally, then what you find is that why would your leaders want to carry on being in that business? Why would your managers want to be the leaders and the executives to maybe a culture which isn't equal? And it's another reason we're definitely losing staff. Neil, did you want to make your point quickly before we wrap up?
Yeah, just to very much say, look, there are a lot of systemic issues facing the sector, and that is regardless of whether or not we want the narrative to be that way. I think we're not necessarily going to get tarred completely with one brush, but we have had significant failings in our approaches to customers. A large amount that relates to the structure of social housing in this country. We peaked in terms of builds in the 1960s. We have got at the moment a real cognitive dissonance between the need to generate more housing because we have more demand than we have supply, but also the need to massively retrofit and improve the stock that we currently have following decades of underinvestment in both. How you solve that without throwing a bucket load of cash in it, well, we're going to find out, because neither of the two main political parties seem particularly keen to take the bull by the horns there. But we're going to be entering into the worst of all worlds, where housing associations are already drawing back on their development programs because of the economic environment in which we are operating. So you're going to find a need to push in more grant into fewer homes to make them worthwhile, because the cost of leveraging and finance is significantly increased. So you've got these multifaceted issues facing the sector, which is going to drive a significant amount of bad outcomes, i.e. less new build, less money to invest in existing properties, whilst having greater scrutiny on the sector. So they are systemic challenges, so they'll naturally flow over all organisations. It's just how each chooses to prioritise and react accordingly that really will make a difference.
I couldn't agree more. Alysha, I'm going to pass across to you for final thoughts on what's been an hour that has completely flown by. I think we could have probably done another one. So please pass over to you for final thoughts. And And I guess that key takeaway that people can start doing right now to really start making change.
I think the quickest thing is talking. So if I ask you, do your family members, your friends actually know what it is that you do? Are they able to explain your job role? That is very easy. I was at a conference and I asked a CEO if she knows what her daughter thinks about what she does. And she said, oh, I don't actually think my daughter knows in detail my role. And, if we're talking about, being advocates of the sector and wanting more people to come into the sector, then we just need to talk, but be honest when we have those conversations about what the sector is about.
Thank you very, very, very much. Thank you for joining today. There's been some lovely comments in the chat about how brilliant you've been. So do please reach out. What is LinkedIn the best way for people to get in touch with you with follow-up questions?
Yes. Brilliant. Yeah, LinkedIn.
It's Alysha Burrell. Please reach out to her. But for now, a massive thank you to you. A massive thank you to all of our guests for today. For everyone who could come along. It's been, I've certainly found it incredibly insightful. Next week, we're going to be talking, oddly time-wise, about the private rented sector and its link with homelessness, which, if anybody saw the comments yesterday from the housing minister, could be an interesting one, because apparently not all people in private rented sector love to smoke weed, was an actual quote from the Tory party conference. So amazing there. But for now, Alysha, thank you so much for today. Thank you for everyone who could join us, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you.